Major Mann, newly resigned from the Defense Intelligence Agency, joins me on Mehdi Unfiltered. Thank you so much for coming on the show. You mentioned in your resignation letter, which you submitted at the start of November, I believe, less than a month after the Israeli assault on Gaza began, that you had always planned to leave the army, but to leave in this abrupt way, much earlier than planned, without even another job lined up. How much did events in Gaza and the US role in Gaza play into that?
Thank you for having me. So I began my resignation in November. I did not share the reasons until months later in April. But the war in Gaza and our role in it and my contribution to that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and the reason I ultimately understood I could not do this work anymore. By November, the course of the war was already, I think, quite clear to me and to anybody who follows this topic in the national security community. And I knew that as long as I stayed, I'd be contributing to this campaign that had already demonstrated basically was going to be indiscriminately killing civilians at an industrial scale. It was going to proceed without the Israeli military really having a realistic or achievable plan, theory of victory or way to end the war. It was going to provoke a lot of dangerous reactions from adversaries around the region that was going to endanger, obviously Israel and also U.S. forces in the region. And it was clear that U.S. support was going to be unwavering in spite of all that. And I kind of lost hope that there was going to be any change of course. And so I knew each day that I stayed, I was going to be contributing to that.
The Defense Intelligence Agency statement about your resignation underplayed your decision to leave by saying that resignations are a routine occurrence for employees at the agency, with no mention from them as to why they think you left. You've been with them for over 2 years, I know. Is that the response you expected? Did you expect something different?
I think they wisely did not weigh in. It's true that that people resign from that and other agencies all the time. There are not people, to my knowledge, who have resigned for this reason, despite the fact that I know a lot of my colleagues feel the same way.
So it's interesting you mention your colleagues. You made a decision that most within the US government have not made, which is to resign over unqualified US support for the government of Israel. You mentioned how you felt alone when you saw the destruction in Gaza, but you say in the letter that you later realized people are just scared to voice similar opinions. Is there a culture of fear within the United States government, within the US military, when it comes to discussing Israel's actions, US involvement in those actions? Are employees expected not to speak about such things?
I think in the communities that I've come up in, which is the military and DoD and now the intel community, there's a strong set of professional norms, which I think are productive, which is people do not discuss politics or other controversial topics. And I think everyone understood that this was a politicized topic, and so people did not feel comfortable discussing it the same way we would not ask each other, who we voted for, or thoughts on other potentially disruptive issues.
So you mentioned a moment ago your own role, my contribution. You don't run the Defense Intelligence Agency. You were a kind of middle management person, to be fair to your role, but you felt you were contributing to the killings in Gaza. I want to ask, what is the role of the US Defense Department, intelligence community in terms of helping, assisting, facilitating Israel's war on Gaza? How involved, how complicit are we, especially at an intelligence level?
I think holistically, defense, military support, intel support, this far into the war, this is not a war that Israel could be prosecuting this way without our sort of maximalist levels of support. I think their dependence on our munitions transfers is pretty well publicized and understood. They would have run out of ammo a long time ago, if not for us. And, you know, in terms of the other support, I would say, you know, the limitations of their own capabilities, I think, you know, were laid pretty clear on October 7th. And, you know, it's also well publicized that we have a very close intelligence relationship with Israel. So I think you can imagine the potential importance of that relationship, especially after October 7th, and especially after this conflict is now spread regionally to places that, you know, I would presume are harder for any one country to understand.
If we cut off, hypothetically, not just our munitions, but our intel, would that make it harder for Israel to carry out this war on Gaza?
I think every discrete form of support helps both encourage what they're doing in the sense of showing that we tacitly approve, and it makes it easier. So, you know, I think it's hard to say any one form of support could end the war, right? Even if we, you know, we cut off a certain type of munitions, well, they could use what they have, or they could still do other stuff. But, you know, as a whole, the protection that we provide them has a very similar outcome as the munitions or the so-called offensive aid that we give them. And steps that help protect them and insulate them from the very predictable regional response to their actions similarly enable them to continue this war. You know, if we have a lot of forces in the Red Sea who are basically battling the Houthis on behalf of Israel to a certain extent. And, you know, if they were not there, F-16s that are currently bombing Gaza would need to be patrolling the southern approaches to Israel to watch out for that threat, just as a kind of broad example.
So it's in the round, the support that we offer, military, intelligence, in the seas, etc. Perhaps the most powerful part of your resignation letter is where you say, quote, at some point, whatever the justification, you're either advancing a policy that enables the mass starvation of children or you're not. I know that I did, in my small way, wittingly advance that policy. And I want to clarify that as the descendant of European Jews, I was raised in a particularly unforgiving moral environment when it came to the topic of bearing responsibility for ethnic cleansing. You go on to point out that your grandfather boycotted German goods. Do you believe what is happening in Gaza is a genocide and that it is appropriate and legitimate to invoke the Holocaust and never again, as you do in the letter, in the context of Gaza?
I feel it's appropriate to invoke never again because my takeaway from the Jewish experience as I was educated in it, I think this is broadly shared by anybody who grows up in the States with my background, is that, you know, the experience of Jews in Europe, you know, not just the Holocaust, but the pogroms. You know, most of my family members or my ancestors left in the early 20th century, but from places that were also unfriendly to Jews. You know, the takeaway from that is it wasn't bad because it happened to Jews. It was bad because it happened to people, and that shouldn't happen to anybody. So I think that, you know, that's what informed my decisions here. It's really, it was very easy for me to see in the Palestinians another unwanted population, the way that Jews were in Europe. You know, another people who, for a very long time, world powers turned, you know, their back on. My family is now mostly in the States and Canada. We have family members who went to Mexico and also to Israel because they couldn't get in to the States or to Britain. And so I think it's, you know, the situations are not totally equivalent, but people existing in this sort of, you know, stateless and undesirable status is very recognizable to me, and I hope it is for anyone who's familiar with Jewish history.
You used the phrase ethnic cleansing, which is a very powerful, provocative phrase. But I'm going to ask again, do you believe what's happening in Gaza constitutes a genocide?
I don't know, and to me, I've since learned that there are a series of legal definitions for that, and I sometimes, it could be, but I also see that as almost immaterial, because what I know for sure is that there's been seemingly orchestrated or at least preventable, killing and starvation of tens of thousands of people, and yeah, it looks like that. Though I've also learned that law of armed conflict and the law in general is not always as restrictive as we hope it would be. So.
Lily Greenberg Call, who resigned from the Department of Interior, was described as the first Jewish American political appointee to quit over Gaza. She accused President Biden of, quote, making Jews the face of the American war machine. Do you agree with that? And as a Jewish American, how do you reconcile the fact that this war for you is a moral injury, as you put it in your letter? But for most Jews in America, according to the polls, Israel's conduct in this war has been acceptable. America should still be supporting Israel. It's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Lily's characterization. It was really, really frustrating for me, especially closer to the beginning of the war, to see American leaders and American Jewish leaders say things to the effect that what Israel's doing is on behalf of all Jews, because I didn't want them to be conducting the war that way. I certainly didn't feel that way. And, this is my opinion, but we've seen this play out. I think it's kind of dangerous to attribute the actions of a foreign actor to all Jews everywhere or Jews in America. And outside of the context of Israel, in my line of work, we usually we usually look closely at people who use violence and say it's on behalf of a global religion.
Yeah. You're making the analogy there between how we talk about Muslims not being blamed for all terrorism and Jews not having to speak for all of Israel.
When there were terrible terrorist attacks, and the perpetrators said they were doing it on behalf of Islam and Muslims everywhere, we saw what the impact of that was in terms of treatment of Muslims in our country, and it looks like we're trying the same experiment with a different religion right now.
It's interesting you bring that up because, of course, a lot of people might be wondering how your criticism of Israel in such a very public way will affect your future career. There's a great debate about how much criticizing Israel becomes anti-Semitism. You're obviously Jewish yourself, so you're slightly inoculated against that, although not that much. Bernie Sanders has been attacked for being anti-Jewish, for calling out Netanyahu. How worried are you that your criticism of Israel will ruin your career, limit your future life chances?
It's going to close some doors. There's no doubt about that. But I also suspected and have increasingly learned, even in national security circles, that my views are not particularly uncommon or controversial. And
let me jump in.
Yeah.
If they're not that uncommon or controversial, how come we don't hear them? Is it fear again?
Yeah, I think it is fear.
Fear of what?
I think it's still understood as a taboo topic, both in the workplace and in public speech as well. My colleagues who reached out to me after I sent my letter internally, and then more after I posted it, yeah, a lot of them said that they felt the same way. They felt like they couldn't say anything. I've also know people who are in more important roles than me, who said, I'm not a white man. If I did this, I would catch so much more hate or reprisal than you have. And, to date, with what I did, it's been overwhelmingly positive support from both colleagues and strangers. But I think people still have a residual understanding of this as a hyper-politicized issue.
Was there a tipping point, I just wonder, was there a moment where that fear went away, where you said, I got to do this, not just resign, but write a letter, go public? Was there one moment, one day? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, beyond the resignation, there were a succession of events that I'm sure you covered that looked like they were going to be the red line or the big outrage that was going to make us reconsider our support. You know, even I think right before I ended up distributing my letter internally was the World Food Kitchen workers killed in Gaza by an Israeli strike. And at the time, I think that was early April, that was an unprecedented level of outrage and criticism. And I thought, oh, okay, well, maybe we're moving in the right direction and I can just sit down and shut up. And then, you know, there was a lot of noise, and I think a week or two later, Israel blew up another marked aid vehicle. And, you know, so then I was like, all right, this is not going to stop. I shared it with my office. Thinking about sharing it with a broader audience, you know, in May, the Rafah incursion that we were assured was not going to happen started. And then the president made a really positive and also unprecedented response and threatened to cut aid, I think, in the most explicit terms that we ever have since the war began. And that turned out not to result in a change in Israeli behavior or an implementation of that threat.
So, last question for you. What is your message to President Biden, who last Friday came out and said there's an Israeli proposal on the table for a three-stage plan to end the war, to get a permanent ceasefire, which the Israeli Prime Minister then immediately and publicly rebuked and said, no, I'm not on board with this. What is your message to President Biden, given where we are?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a message for him, because I think our administration's position has been pretty clear. You know, regardless of what we said in terms of the support that we provide. I am doing this because I want to reach my own peers in the national security and military workforce who are in the position that I was until a couple months ago, which is that they are going to work every day and they understand what they're doing or what they're contributing to is wrong, and they feel like they can't do anything about it. And you know, to a certain extent, that's true, but it's also not. I think once you understand, and they understand that, I don't think anyone's going to tell them to stop anytime soon, even despite what's happening this week. If I'm proven wrong, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
But when you understand no one's going to tell you to stop, and which means effectively the decision to keep supporting this has been delegated down to you, you feel a little more urgency. And it doesn't mean all those folks need to resign, but I'd like them to understand that, you know, I know a lot of people in the broader community have asked for transfers. I know people who have gone to their boss and said, hey, I'm doing 90% of my job, you know, to the max, like I always do, find someone else to do the Israel portfolio. Like I said, I know people who are exploring challenging the legality, and at very least, you know, I would say, if you're somebody who's afraid to talk about it, start talking about it, because there's somebody else who is in your office who feels the same way as you do. They feel like they're alone too. They're afraid to say anything, and even if the most that you can do is just talk, you know, that person in the cubicle next to you, maybe they have a little more ability to talk to leadership or transfer or do something more effective. So that's who I want to address. That's why I'm here.